This is Section 8, Lecture 3. We are still discussing national security policy, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about nuclear policy. Nuclear policy is an area that could be discussed throughout an entire semester. It's so vast, its theories, its practices. But here we're going to be touching on it briefly and hitting some of the more important elements influential to our national security policy. We mentioned the idea of deterrence in an earlier lecture. Deterrence, remember, is very simply keeping another nation state from attacking yours. And one of the ways to keep another nation state from attacking yours is to have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are so destructive that if they can be used against an aggressor, that is the country who's attacking you, then that country should or would be facing such a large threat that they wouldn't dare to attack you. And so this idea of maintaining nuclear deterrence is based on a couple of elements. I have here two pillars of nuclear deterrence are credibility and survivability of the weapons. The credibility part is the credibility of your leaders, the credibility of your nation. And it is a psychological influence. Do your leaders have the willingness and resolve to use these destructive weapons? Oftentimes leaders would be reluctant, knowing that maybe in retaliation they would have nuclear weapons used in response. And because nuclear weapons are so destructive, you wouldn't want that response or that destruction to come to your own country. And that may keep a leader from using them. But the other element is what oftentimes our nuclear policy focuses on, and that is the survivability of weapons. Do we have the physical capacity to carry out the threat of using our nuclear weapons? And the term that is used in nuclear strategy when it comes to our national defense policy is a second strike capability. The second strike capability is the ability to use nuclear weapons second. That is, when another nation state uses them on you, do you have the ability to use them back? And if you have the ability to respond by using nuclear weapons in a second nuclear strike, then that aggressive nation state would be deterred, kept from using their nuclear weapons on you. Once again, this goes back to the ultimate destructiveness of these weapons. But there are other elements to this strategic thought. When we talk about using military force, but particularly nuclear weapons, there are different types of targets. One is referred to as a counter-value target. That is an opponent's cities and its population base. And the other is a counter-force target. That's its military capabilities. And then I have there this term C3I, command, control, communications, and intelligence. And so when it comes to using your nuclear weapons and deterring others from using theirs on you, these two types of targets become important. Because the idea of deterrence and the second strike capability fundamentally relies on the counter-value target being threatened. Let's say that you're facing off with another country who has nuclear weapons. Well, if you use yours against their military, which you see their military as the greatest threat, the second strike capability would have us believe that as long as you have at least one nuclear weapon that's viable, you should launch it not at the other country's military, but at their population centers, their cultural centers, their main cities. So they may be destroying your military with their nuclear weapons, but you would be destroying their civilization, their population, their major cities with your nuclear weapons. And so as long as that threat exists and it's credible, then you are said to have a viable second strike capability. And that viable second strike capability should keep countries from using their nuclear weapons on you. As long as a nation state has a credible second strike capability, the population of that nation is said to be hostage to that counter value attack, an attack against its population center, its major cities, its cultural centers. Where there is a credible second strike capability, there is no incentive to strike first using your nuclear weapons. And so then, if a country could destroy another country's weapons, its nuclear weapons, without retaliation, there would be the incentive to do so. But because you can't guarantee that they're not going to have some nuclear weapons surviving, that second strike capability is seen to be viable. This theory, this idea has been the basis of our national security policy and our nuclear policy throughout the Cold War and even today. In the 1950s and in 1960s were the development of these ideas. How do we keep our populations safe from a nuclear strike? Well, we could use civil defense, ballistic missile defense. We do now have viable ballistic missile defense to an extent, but it's always been something that has been limited in its efficiency. In the early 2000s, ballistic missile defense systems, that is missile-to-missile technology, where you fire a missile at an incoming nuclear missile, was only successful at about a 50% rate. We saw in a recent Israeli war where they used what they call their Iron Dome missiles, which they got from the United States ballistic missile technology, that the rate was a little bit higher, but still some missiles were getting in and hitting the ground. Well, if those had been nuclear missiles, you would see a much different view of destructiveness. So this focus on a viable second strike capability became the basis of our nuclear policy during the Cold War, and subsequently became the policy also of the Soviet Union. This deterred them from using their nuclear missiles against us, and us from using our nuclear missiles against them. And the way that it was done was to spread out our nuclear arsenal. And the key element of this is our nuclear triad. The United States kept intercontinental ballistic missiles, that's ICBMs, all over our territory and other people's territories as well, spread out so much that any number of nuclear strikes in those areas would not have been able to get all the nuclear missiles that we had in one and destroy them. And so then we would have had that second strike capability. But we also, as our nuclear policy developed, kept bombers on runways all the time that could take off at a moment's notice, and kept submarines at sea all the time. That's submarine launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, that I have there at the bottom. And so this triad, these 3 points of nuclear defense, was said to maintain our second strike capability. Because even if all the nuclear technology was destroyed in the intercontinental ballistic missiles by the Soviets and the bombers were destroyed, they couldn't realistically get to the submarines. And they cut down the time that the bombers could get off the ground to an extent where that wouldn't be a realistic idea either. And so then we maintained our second strike capability. And this began to be developed under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He was the Secretary of Defense for Kennedy and Johnson. And he referred to this as the assured destruction policy to deter a Soviet attack. But in response, the Soviet Union did the same things and invested in the same technology. And so the nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, because both had a viable second strike capability, began to be known as mutually assured destruction, MAD, a good acronym for the use of nuclear weapons. If we look at our relatively current strategic threat regarding nuclear weapons, right, we see that Russia has been our main foe throughout the Cold War, and even today. They still maintain a higher number of active warheads than the United States, and they still maintain that nuclear triad delivery system. But these numbers, we have to remind ourselves, have gone down greatly. The numbers of active warheads from the United States and Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, were well into the upper thousands, if not over tens of thousands. The UK developed nuclear weapons in the 1950s and still maintains that. That was an element of contention during the Scottish independence vote because their submarine stations are in Scotland. China developed nuclear weapons and still maintains them. France developed nuclear weapons and has a submarine launched system. India developed nuclear weapons, and in response we saw Pakistan develop nuclear weapons as well. Israel is a hidden nuclear state. That is, they don't claim to have nuclear weapons, but according to analysts, there's an estimated 80 to 100 warheads. And then North Korea is the last nuclear country, and they are estimated to have around 10 warheads. Well, the response to this strategic threat of nuclear weapons was seen in the balance of power theory from the Truman administration through the Reagan administration. But we have mentioned in earlier lectures that during the Reagan administration there was a focus or a shift away from the balance of power to the idea of power preponderance. And it was seen in as a way to limit the nuclear threat, or even to get rid of the nuclear threat. In that way we would have a vast superiority over the Soviet Union. And so during the Reagan administration, to face this nuclear threat, they began the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which in the media was always referred to as Star Wars. Well, this was during the early 80s when the original 3 Star Wars movies were still coming out, or very popular. And what this called for was a 7-layer plan that included the nuclear triad system, but also included ballistic missile defense, that is, missile to missile technology, using a missile to shoot another one out of the sky or space. X-ray laser beams, particle laser beams. This is something that was seen and mocked in a movie called Spies Like Us in 1985, with Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd were fake spies sent into Russia to launch a nuclear weapon so that the Air Force could test their particle beam laser. Chemical lasers, mirror-based lasers that would have been placed on airplanes. This was also mocked in another movie called Real Genius with Val Kilmer, where he was at a technical university, like it wasn't MIT or CIT, it's so probably some no-name university, but they had the scientific technology and the students to be able to develop these very sophisticated lasers at the time during the 1980s. And space-based interceptors. That was an idea where you would have these smaller spacecraft in space, or even satellites that would have lasers on them that would shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles as they came towards the United States. Well, this was a 7-layer plan, and the estimate was going to be that each of these layers would have 20% effectiveness against an incoming nuclear warheads. I'm not a mathematician, but this sounds good anyway. 7 times 20 is 140%, and in that way 140% equals safe. Well, we still have the nuclear triad. We did have these great advancements in laser technology. We do now have more advanced ballistic missile defense, but some of these other initiatives kind of have fallen by the wayside, or at least have not gotten off the ground publicly. Currently, we see then our position in nuclear weapons towards the rest of the world in our nuclear posture review. Now, this is something that is an assessment done during every presidential administration, and maybe even multiple times during presidential administrations, but usually these are secret. In 2001, the Bush administration's nuclear posture review was leaked, and that's how the public knew about it. But the Obama administration, when they did their nuclear posture review in 2010, allowed it to be publicized, or at least the general points of it. And so you see then, as part of our nuclear policy, an influence on our greater national security policy. We want to prevent nuclear proliferation, that is, the spread of nuclear weapons, new countries developing nuclear weapons. Well, we could say that that has had a role in our negotiations about the nuclear program in Iran, for example. We want to reduce the role of nuclear weapons here in the United States, and as a response, the Obama administration had a series of nuclear reduction talks with Russia when President Medvedev was in charge there. That was called START 2, that reduced the number of standing warheads of each country. We want to maintain those abilities that we already have, just at reduced numbers. And so maintain the nuclear triad, maintain the survivability of our weapons, so on and so forth, as part of our nuclear policy. Also, other elements of our nuclear policy currently are to strengthen regional deterrence by providing ballistic missile defense systems to our allies. This was something that was controversial in the beginning of the Obama administration, and in some ways they backed down by sending ballistic missile defense to Poland and to other Eastern European countries. But in the wake of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, or at least their support in the civil war in Ukraine, their invasion of Georgia and South Ossetia, then we see a revision of that policy, or that backing down, that now we want Eastern European countries to have these ballistic missile defense systems once again. Maintaining our arsenal but not engaging in new tests is also another element. And throughout our recent history, we have any number of disarmament or arms control treaties. This is focused at reducing the threat of nuclear weapons from others, and in exchange reducing our standing level of nuclear weapons as well. And so you see then a reduction of missile talks, SALT, strategic arms limitation talks, during the Nixon administration began this. During the Reagan administration, you see there that they were focused so much on power preponderance that they didn't necessarily want to engage in nuclear reductions treaties, even though they went on to do so. Nuclear test ban treaties were something that began in the 1950s. There were any number of tests around the world, in Nevada, here in the United States, on land, and in other places, in the Bikini Atoll. Very famously, you may have seen that movie footage of nuclear weapons going off out in the middle of the ocean. Well, because of the destructiveness of this, because of the potential for creating atmospheric problems, nuclear nations have began to discuss banning the tests of their nuclear weapons. But North Korea, India, Pakistan have all tested their nuclear weapons once they've developed them underground. And then there have been any number of non-proliferation treaties that have gone on. And this is something that we're going to be discussing regarding your discussion question for this section. The limitation of the nuclear threat can be based on limiting the number of nuclear weapons out there and the number of countries that have these weapons. And so this is what non-proliferation treaties are based on. And all of this is about limiting the threat of nuclear weapons by limiting their number and limiting the number of countries that have them. And we see then a series of disarmament and arms control treaties. START treaty reduced active nuclear weapons to 6,000. START 2 was never ratified. We've had chemical weapons conventions and bans. In other areas of the world that don't have nuclear weapons, those nation states have banded together to come up with their own treaties and create nuclear-free zones, such as in Southeast Asia and Africa. And the most recent disarmament treaty was called New START, as I mentioned earlier, negotiated by President Obama and President Medvedev of Russia, reducing the number of standing U.S. warheads to 1,500 on 800 missiles, which would be both land-based and submarine-based, and on 700 warheads on bombers.